Hello everyone and welcome back to the channel. My name is MM, and if there's one thing we love to talk about in South Africa, it's politics. And if there's another thing we love to talk about, it's money. Specifically, who has it, where it's going, and who's asking for it, which brings us to today's topic. Today we're counting down the top 10 South African politicians who engaged with the IMF. Now hold on, before you click away thinking this is some dry economics lecture, stick with me. This is about power, promises, and the quiet deals that shape our daily lives more than we realize. So, what even is the IMF, the International Monetary Fund? Think of it as the world's financial emergency room. When a country's economy is on life support, they can go to the IMF for a loan. But, and this is a big but, these loans come with strings attached, what they call conditionalities. These are basically a set of rules the country has to follow, like cutting government spending, privatizing state companies, or changing its economic policies. It's like your rich uncle giving you a loan for rent, but only if you promise to stop ordering takeout and finally get a real job. In South Africa, the IMF is a political hot potato. For some, it represents a loss of sovereignty, a surrender to foreign powers who don't understand our unique challenges. For others, it's a necessary evil, a bitter pill to swallow to fix a broken economy. Our history with the IMF is complex, stretching back to the dying days of apartheid and weaving through every administration since. The decisions to engage or not to engage with this global financial giant have defined careers, sparked fierce debates, and ultimately shaped the economic reality for millions of South Africans. It's a story of tough choices and even tougher consequences. Kicking off our list at number 10 is the man currently at the helm, President Cyril Ramaphosa. Now, you might think of him more for his family meetings and his buffaloes, but his administration has had one of the most significant direct engagements with the IMF in recent memory. It's a move that was both predictable and, for many, deeply concerning. The stage was set by a global crisis none of us saw coming, but the economic vulnerabilities were already there, simmering just below the surface for years. The year was 2020. The world was shutting down, and South Africa's economy, already struggling with low growth and high unemployment, was pushed to the brink. It was in this moment of unprecedented crisis that the Ramaphosa administration turned to the IMF. They secured a $4.3 billion loan, not under the usual strict policy reforming programs, but through a special rapid financing instrument designed for emergencies like the pandemic. It was sold as a low conditionality loan, a quick injection of cash to fight the health and economic fallout. But in the world of international finance, is there ever truly no strings attached? Critics immediately raised the alarm. They argued that even this emergency loan opened a door that had long been kept shut. The fear wasn't just about this specific loan, but about the precedent it set. It was seen as a signal to the world, and to the IMF itself, that South Africa was now willing to play ball, potentially leading to more traditional and more restrictive loans down the line. The debate was fierce. On one side, the government argued it was a pragmatic choice. Where else could they get that much money that quickly on such favorable terms? They needed it for PPE, for social grants, for keeping the lights on. It was, in their view, a responsible act of governance in an impossible situation. They pointed to the fact that the loan didn't require the harsh austerity measures often associated with the IMF, like firing public sector workers or slashing social spending. On the other side, unions and civil society groups were deeply skeptical. They saw it as the thin end of the wedge. They pointed to the IMF's historical track record in other African and developing nations, where initial loans led to cycles of debt and imposed policies that often hurt the poorest citizens the most. The phrase debt trap was on everyone's lips. They worried that this was the first step on a slippery slope towards losing our economic sovereignty. Ultimately, the loan was secured, and the money was spent. But the story didn't end there. The engagement has put Ramaphosa's government under a microscope. Every budget speech, every policy document is now scrutinized for any hint of IMF influence. Is the push for fiscal consolidation, for reining in government debt, a homegrown policy, or a subtle nod to the lenders in Washington? It's a question that hangs over his presidency, making his relationship with the IMF a defining and deeply controversial part of his economic legacy. Coming in at number 9, we have a man who is as famous for his Twitter cooking experiments as he is for his economic policies, the one and only Tito Mboweni. As finance minister under Ramaphosa, Mboweni was the man on the front lines, the one who had to stand up in parliament and actually make the case for that controversial $4.3 billion IMF loan. He was, for all intents and purposes, the public face of this pivotal economic decision. Mboweni's position was fascinating because he has a long and complex history with economic policy in South Africa. As a former governor of the South African Reserve Bank, he was seen as an orthodox, steady hand. He understood the language of international markets and institutions like the IMF. When he was brought back as finance minister, it was seen as a move to restore confidence among investors. But he was also a veteran of the ANC, a party with a deep-seated historical suspicion of these very institutions. So when the pandemic hit, Mboweni found himself in the hot seat. He had to navigate the treacherous waters between the country's desperate need for cash and his own party's ideological resistance to borrowing from the IMF. He framed the decision not as a surrender, but as a strategic move. He argued that the IMF's rapid financing instrument was the cheapest money they could get on the international market at that time. It was, in his words, a practical solution to an unprecedented problem. He often seemed exasperated by the political pushback, famously tweeting and speaking about the need for South Africa to avoid the hippo's mouth of debt. Yet he was the one advocating for this particular loan. This apparent contradiction made him a lightning rod for criticism. He was accused of being a neoliberal agent, pushing the country towards the very austerity he claimed to be trying to avoid. His public statements were a masterclass in tightrope walking, trying to reassure both global markets and the local populace. His approach was one of blunt pragmatism. In his budget speeches, he was the bearer of bad news, constantly highlighting the country's dire financial situation, the ballooning government wage bill, the debt-to-GDP ratio, the cost of bailing out failing state-owned enterprises. He would often present these facts as an ultimatum. Either we make these tough choices ourselves, or institutions like the IMF will eventually force us to make even tougher ones. The loan, in his view, was a tool to buy time to get our own house in order. Mboweni's tenure was a constant battle, a tug-of-war between his economic orthodoxy and the political realities of the ANC alliance. His open frustration with the slow pace of economic reform and his willingness to publicly champion the IMF loan, even when it was politically toxic, makes him a crucial figure in this story. He wasn't just an official carrying out a policy, he was its chief advocate and defender, placing him firmly on our list. At number 8, we have a man who has become synonymous with South Africa's national treasury, a figure who has been at the center of the country's economic battles for years, Pravin Gordhan. His story with the IMF is less about a single, dramatic loan, and more about a long, sustained engagement with the principles and policies that the IMF champions. He is seen by many as the architect and defender of South Africa's post-apartheid fiscal discipline. Gordhan's time as finance minister across 2 different stints was defined by a commitment to what's often called fiscal consolidation. That's the fancy term for reining in government spending, reducing the budget deficit, and stabilizing debt. These are, not coincidentally, the exact same prescriptions the IMF gives to countries it lends to. While South Africa wasn't taking on a traditional IMF program under his watch, Gordhan was steering the ship with a very similar map. This made him a hero to some and a villain to others. For the business community and international ratings agencies, Gordhan was a symbol of stability and predictability. His budget speeches, which often spoke of prudence and living within our means, were music to their ears. They saw him as the bulwark against populist spending, and the man who kept South Africa's credentials intact in the eyes of global finance, including institutions like the IMF, who regularly conduct surveillance missions to assess member countries' economies. However, within his own political alliance, this very same stance made him a target. The ANC's partners COSATU and the SACP, and even factions within the ANC itself, saw his policies as austerity by stealth. They argued that his tight grip on the national purse strings was choking social development. They contended that by cutting spending to please the markets and preempt the need for an IMF bailout, he was effectively implementing an IMF program without the loan, starving essential services of much-needed funds. The tension came to a head during the Jacob Zuma presidency, where Gordhan's refusal to sign off on certain projects like the controversial nuclear deal was seen as a direct clash between his fiscal conservatism and the president's political ambitions. His eventual firing in 2017 sent shockwaves through the economy, with the rand plummeting, precisely because he was seen as the gatekeeper against the kind of reckless spending that often leads countries into the arms of the IMF. Now, as the Minister of Public Enterprises, Gordhan is still at the heart of the debate. He's tasked with reforming South Africa's ailing state-owned enterprises like Eskom and SAA. The push to restructure these companies, bring in private sector partners and make them financially viable aligns perfectly with standard IMF recommendations. So while he may not have signed a loan agreement in the same way as Mboweni, Pravin Gordhan's entire political career has been a dance with the ghost of the IMF, shaping policy to keep them at bay, but in doing so, often adopting the very medicine they would prescribe. Landing at number 7 is a true titan of South Africa's economic landscape, the country's longest-serving finance minister, Trevor Manuel. If Pravin Gordhan was the defender of fiscal discipline, Trevor Manuel was its primary architect. His tenure, from 1996 to 2009, spanned the crucial formative years of South Africa's democracy, and his policies set the economic course for a generation. His relationship with the IMF was foundational. When Manuel took the reins of the national treasury, South Africa was in a precarious position. The new democratic government had inherited a bankrupt state, crippled by sanctions and apartheid-era mismanagement. The world, including the IMF and World Bank, was watching very closely. There was immense pressure on the ANC government to prove it could manage a modern economy responsibly. The fear of having to go cap in hand to the IMF for a bailout was very, very real. It was in this context that Manuel introduced the now famous or infamous GEAR policy in 1996, the Growth, Employment and Redistribution Strategy. Despite its name, its core tenets were fiscal restraint, inflation targeting, trade liberalization, and privatization. Policies that were almost indistinguishable from a standard IMF structural adjustment program. This was no accident. It was a deliberate strategy to preempt any potential IMF intervention by voluntarily adopting their preferred policies. This move caused a massive rift within the tripartite alliance. COSATU and the SACP felt betrayed. They had envisioned a post-apartheid state with a far more interventionist, redistributive economic model. They saw GEAR as a neoliberal turn, a capitulation to the Washington Consensus, the economic policy package promoted by the IMF, the World Bank, and the US Treasury. They argued that Manuel was sacrificing the developmental needs of the people at the altar of global market confidence. Manuel, however, defended his approach relentlessly. He argued that without macroeconomic stability, there could be no sustainable development. He needed to build credibility, lower the country's borrowing costs, and attract foreign investment to fund the new government's ambitious social programs. In his view, GEAR wasn't about bowing to the IMF, but about creating the economic space to pursue the ANC's goals without interference. It was a strategic, if painful, choice. Throughout his 13 years as minister, Manuel became a respected figure in global financial circles, chairing meetings of the IMF and World Bank. He cultivated a close working relationship with these institutions, not as a borrower, but as a peer. He successfully navigated the Asian financial crisis of the late 90s and the global financial crisis of 2008 without having to ask for a bailout. For his supporters, this was the ultimate vindication of his strategy. For his critics, it was proof that he had internalized the IMF's worldview so completely that the country was on a permanent, self-imposed structural adjustment program. Our halfway point, number 6, might be a surprise to some. It's President Jacob Zuma. Known for his populist rhetoric and his administration's association with radical economic transformation, Zuma's presidency is often seen as the antithesis of the buttoned-down, fiscally conservative world of the IMF. However, the reality is more complex. His actions and inactions had a profound, albeit indirect, impact on South Africa's relationship with the fund. Zuma's presidency wasn't marked by direct negotiations or loan applications to the IMF. In fact, his political language was often hostile to institutions like the IMF and World Bank, framing them as agents of Western imperialism. He championed the formation of the BRICS New Development Bank as an alternative source of funding for developing nations, precisely to avoid having to turn to Washington. On the surface, he was pushing back against the established financial order. But here's the paradox. The very policies and governance failures that occurred under his watch dramatically increased the likelihood of a future IMF bailout. The period known as state capture saw the systematic weakening of key institutions, including the National Treasury and SARS. Rampant corruption, wasteful expenditure, and the plundering of state-owned enterprises hollowed out the country's finances. Economic growth stagnated, and government debt began to skyrocket. Think of it like this. Zuma wasn't inviting the IMF to dinner, but he was burning down the kitchen and leaving the next person with no choice but to call for help. The firing of respected finance ministers like Nhlanhla Nene and Pravin Gordhan sent shockwaves through the markets, causing the currency to collapse and borrowing costs to soar. These actions, driven by internal political battles, were seen by international investors and ratings agencies as a catastrophic failure of governance. The IMF, in its regular country reports during this period, grew increasingly alarmed. Their language became more pointed, warning about rising fiscal risks, governance challenges, and the urgent need for structural reforms. While these were just recommendations, they were a clear signal that the country was heading down a dangerous path. The economic damage done during the Zuma years created the deep hole that his successor, Cyril Ramaphosa, would later have to seek IMF assistance to begin climbing out of. So while Jacob Zuma never personally picked up the phone to the IMF, his presidency created the perfect storm of economic conditions that made an IMF intervention almost inevitable. His legacy is a stark reminder that actively resisting the IMF in rhetoric, while simultaneously creating a fiscal crisis through mismanagement, can lead you straight to their door. It's a classic case of actions speaking much louder than words. At number 5, we have a figure whose time at the top was brief, but occurred during a moment of global financial panic: Kgalema Motlanthe. He served as the interim president of South Africa for just under 8 months, from September 2008 to May 2009, bridging the gap between the recall of Thabo Mbeki and the election of Jacob Zuma. His short tenure coincided with the peak of the global financial crisis. Motlanthe inherited a government in turmoil and a world economy in freefall. Lehman Brothers had just collapsed, and credit markets around the globe were frozen. For a developing economy like South Africa, deeply integrated into the global financial system, this was a moment of extreme danger. The key priority for his caretaker administration was simple: to project an image of stability and calm, both to the South African public and to the anxious international markets. His engagement with the IMF was therefore not one of borrowing, but of reassurance. The key figure here was his finance minister, Trevor Manuel, whom Motlanthe wisely kept in his post. By retaining Manuel, Motlanthe sent a powerful signal that there would be no radical departure from the prudent fiscal policies that had defined the previous decade. It was a message aimed squarely at the likes of the IMF, ratings agencies, and foreign investors, telling them that South Africa was a steady ship in a stormy sea. During this period, the IMF itself was in crisis mode, transforming its role from a lender of last resort to a coordinator of the global response. Motlanthe's government participated in international forums like the G20, where world leaders, including those from the IMF, scrambled to put together a plan to save the world economy. South Africa's role, under Motlanthe and Manuel, was that of a responsible, level-headed emerging market, a partner in the solution rather than part of the problem. This was a critical, though often overlooked moment. Had Motlanthe's interim government panicked, or had he replaced Manuel with a more populist figure, investor confidence could have collapsed. This might have triggered a capital flight and a currency crisis, which could very well have forced South Africa to seek emergency assistance from the IMF. His administration's primary interaction with the fund was, therefore, one of successful prevention. So while Kgalema Motlanthe's name isn't on any loan agreements, his brief presidency was a crucial test of South Africa's economic resilience. By maintaining policy continuity and engaging calmly on the world stage during a period of unprecedented fear, he played a key role in steering the country through the storm without having to make that dreaded call to Washington. His was a quiet but vital chapter in the ongoing story of South Africa and the IMF. Coming in at number 4 is a man whose name is forever linked with one of the most dramatic moments in South Africa's recent economic history: Nhlanhla Nene. Like Pravin Gordhan, Nene was a product of the National Treasury system, known for his commitment to fiscal discipline. His two separate stints as finance minister were both defined by his relationship with global financial institutions and the political battles that this relationship provoked. Nene's first term as finance minister from 2014 to 2015 saw him continue the prudent path laid out by his predecessors, Manuel and Gordhan. He was a known quantity, a safe pair of hands. His public statements and budget policies were all about sticking to spending ceilings, reducing the deficit, and maintaining the confidence of international investors, and, by extension, institutions like the IMF. He was holding the line against growing pressure for more populist spending. The defining moment of his career, and his most significant, albeit indirect engagement with the world of the IMF, came on December 9, 2015. On that day, President Zuma abruptly fired him. The widely accepted reason was Nene's refusal to approve the highly controversial nuclear energy deal with Russia, a project that would have cost South Africa an estimated 1 trillion rand, and plunged the country into unsustainable debt. Nene, the fiscal guardian, stood in the way. His firing triggered an economic meltdown, an event now known as Nene-gate. The rand went into freefall and the stock market lost billions in value almost overnight. Why? Because the market saw Nene as the last line of defense against the kind of catastrophic financial decision-making that forces countries into IMF bailouts. His removal was interpreted as a sign that the floodgates of reckless spending were about to open. The backlash was so severe, both locally and internationally, that Zuma was forced to reappoint a trusted face, Pravin Gordhan, just a few days later. When Nene was reappointed as finance minister by Cyril Ramaphosa in 2018, it was specifically to restore the credibility that had been shattered. His return was a signal to the world, including the IMF, that South Africa was back on the path of fiscal prudence. He immediately began work on an economic stimulus package, one that emphasized fiscal sustainability and aimed to reassure investors, all themes that are central to the IMF's playbook. Nene's story is a powerful illustration of how a politician's standing with the IMF and global markets can become a major political issue. He was fired for upholding the very principles the IMF espouses, and his removal caused a crisis that demonstrated the market's reliance on those principles. His career shows that in a globalized world, a finance minister's job is a balancing act, and sometimes, standing up for fiscal orthodoxy can cost you your job, only to have the consequences of your departure prove you right. At number 3 on our list is the current Minister of Finance, Enoch Godongwana. As the man holding the national purse strings today, he is at the sharp end of the legacy left by all the politicians we've already discussed. He inherited an economy battered by the pandemic, weakened by years of state capture, and already indebted to the IMF. His every move is scrutinized for how it aligns with or deviates from the path of his predecessors. Godongwana's engagement with the IMF is ongoing and multifaceted. Firstly, he is responsible for managing the repayment and reporting requirements associated with the $4.3 billion loan taken in 2020. This means his ministry is in regular contact with the fund, providing updates on South Africa's economic performance and policy decisions. While the loan had low conditionality, the IMF is still watching very closely, and their public statements on South Africa's economy carry immense weight. Secondly, Godongwana has had to publicly and repeatedly fend off speculation that South Africa will need to go back to the IMF for a more substantial traditional bailout package. With slow economic growth, record-high unemployment, and the enormous debt burden of state-owned enterprises like Eskom, the question is constantly being asked. His job is to project confidence and convince the world that South Africa can solve its own problems. In his budget speeches, Godongwana has walked a very fine line. He has continued the theme of fiscal consolidation, emphasizing the need to stabilize debt and cut wasteful expenditure. This is classic IMF-friendly language, designed to reassure markets. He has stated that South Africa's economic recovery plan is a homegrown strategy, not one dictated by Washington. The message is clear. We are taking the tough medicine ourselves, so we don't need the IMF to force-feed it to us. However, critics from the left argue that this is a distinction without a difference. They contend that his austerity-focused budgets, which have seen real-term cuts in spending on essential services, are precisely what an IMF program would demand. They see his policies not as a way of avoiding the IMF, but as a full-scale implementation of the IMF's ideology, just without the official stamp. The debate rages. Is he saving South Africa from the IMF, or is he simply its undeclared agent? Godongwana's position is perhaps the most difficult of all. He doesn't have the economic boom of the 2000s that Manuel enjoyed, nor the clear crisis of the pandemic that Mboweni faced. He is in a state of chronic, grinding economic difficulty. His statements at IMF and World Bank annual meetings are watched closely, as he tries to attract investment while simultaneously pushing back against the narrative that South Africa is a basket case in need of rescue. His tenure is a live-action case study in managing a fragile economy under the constant shadow of the IMF. Nearing the top of our list at number 2 is a name that for many is synonymous with the era of state capture, Malusi Gigaba. His 2 short but incredibly turbulent stints as finance minister were marked by controversy and a sharp deviation from the fiscal conservatism of his predecessors. His engagement with the IMF was not one of collaboration, but of confrontation and ultimately, crisis. Gigaba was first appointed finance minister in March 2017, replacing Pravin Gordhan. The markets reacted with immediate panic. Unlike Gordhan, Nene or Manuel, Gigaba had no background in the national treasury. He was seen as a Zuma loyalist, appointed to open the taps for projects that the more orthodox ministers had blocked. His appointment was viewed as a direct assault on the treasury's independence, a move that would fast-track the country towards a fiscal cliff and a potential IMF bailout. During his tenure, Gigaba's rhetoric shifted dramatically. He started talking about radical economic transformation and questioning the prudent policies of the past. While this language was popular with certain factions, it deeply unnerved investors and ratings agencies. They saw it as code for irresponsible spending, which would blow out the budget deficit and make South Africa's debt unmanageable. The IMF's surveillance reports from this period reflect growing concern over the lack of a credible fiscal framework. One of the most significant moments of his time in office was his attendance at the IMF and World Bank spring meetings in 2017. Instead of reassuring investors, his trip was dogged by controversy and accusations that he was traveling with advisors linked to the Gupta family. The trip, meant to build confidence, did the exact opposite. It reinforced the perception that the South African treasury was no longer being run in the national interest, but for the benefit of private, connected individuals. This period was characterized by a rapid deterioration of public finances. Bailouts for state-owned enterprises like SAA and Eskom accelerated without credible turnaround plans. The credibility of the treasury, carefully built over 2 decades, was being eroded in a matter of months. This damage is precisely what creates the conditions for an IMF intervention. When a country's own financial institutions lose all credibility, external ones are often seen as the only solution. Gigaba was eventually removed as finance minister when Cyril Ramaphosa took office, but the damage had been done. His time in the role serves as a critical case study in how quickly a country's financial standing can be destroyed. He represents the polar opposite of the Trevor Manuel approach. Instead of preempting the IMF by adopting their policies, his administration's actions seem to be actively courting the kind of economic disaster that makes an IMF rescue package unavoidable. And at the number 1 spot on our list, we have a figure who operated not from the political cauldron of Parliament, but from the cool analytical halls of the South African Reserve Bank, Gill. As the governor of the SARB from 2009 to 2014, she was at the heart of the country's monetary policy during a challenging post-financial crisis period. Her engagement with the IMF was that of a peer, a central banker navigating a complex global environment. The governor of the Reserve Bank holds a unique position. While independent from government, their policies have a massive impact on the economy. The governor is also South Africa's official representative on the IMF's Board of Governors. This means Marcus was not just a subject of IMF surveillance, she was part of its governance structure, sitting at the table where global financial decisions were made. This gave her a unique and powerful perspective. Marcus's tenure was defined by the aftermath of the 2008 global financial crisis. While South Africa had avoided the worst of the crash, the global recovery was slow and uncertain. She had to balance keeping inflation under control with supporting a sluggish economy. Her decisions on interest rates were watched intensely, not just in South Africa but by international bodies like the IMF, as a key indicator of the country's economic health and policy direction. Her speeches and public statements were models of central bank caution and credibility. She often spoke about the importance of structural reforms to boost South Africa's growth potential. reforms in the energy sector, labor market and education. This message was perfectly aligned with the advice the IMF was giving the South African government in its annual Article 4 consultations. Marcus, from her independent position, could amplify these calls for reform without the political baggage that a finance minister might carry. This created a fascinating dynamic. While the political wing of government might be resisting or slow-walking reforms, the Reserve Bank under Marcus was often publicly highlighting their necessity. She acted as a powerful, credible voice for economic orthodoxy. This bolstered the confidence of international investors and the IMF, who saw the SARB as a reliable and independent anchor in a sometimes turbulent political sea. Her steady hand was a key reason why South Africa maintained its investment-grade credit rating for much of her tenure. Gil Marcus tops our list because she represents the most institutionalized and deeply embedded form of engagement with the IMF. It wasn't about a single loan or a political crisis, but about the day-to-day, high-level management of the economy in a way that is fully integrated with the global financial architecture that the IMF oversees. She wielded immense influence, shaping the economic environment and ensuring that South Africa, through its central bank, remained a credible player in the eyes of the world's most powerful financial institution. So there you have it. 10 influential figures, 10 different stories, all woven into the complex tapestry of South Africa's relationship with the International Monetary Fund. From the preemptive policies of Trevor Manuel, to the emergency loan under Cyril Ramaphosa, from the fiscal guardianship of Pravin Gordhan, to the crisis-inducing actions of Malusi Gigaba, the shadow of the IMF looms large. It has shaped our budgets, influenced our policies, and fueled some of the most intense political debates in our democratic history. The impact is undeniable. The engagement, whether direct or indirect, has forced a constant conversation about South Africa's place in the global economy. It has created a permanent tension between the desire for national sovereignty and the demands of international markets. For some, this has been a necessary discipline, preventing fiscal ruin. For others, it has been a straitjacket, limiting the state's ability to address the deep-seated inequalities left by apartheid. This isn't just an economic story, it's a political one that cuts to the very core of what kind of country South Africa wants to be. This relationship is a living story, one that continues to unfold with every budget speech and every economic report. The choices made by these 10 individuals have set the stage for the challenges we face today. But what do you think? Which politician on this list surprised you the most? Was it someone you thought was anti-IMF who actually created the conditions for their involvement, or someone you thought was just a bureaucrat who turned out to be a major player? Let me know in the comments below. I'm MM, thanks for watching.